Welcome to ILV's book club. And this quarter, what we're looking at is Yasmine Mohammed's Unveiled. And it is her story. It's a very personal story around her life growing up in an Islamic society in Canada and the struggles that she had and how she kind of broke through that. And we're going to, for our audience, please know we will have a live stream on March 2nd at 3 p.m. Eastern with Yasmine. So join us then. Join us reading along with the book as well, and our weekly podcasts and book discussion that we will have forth upcoming to March 2nd live stream. So what we've decided, this is ILV, right? It's the Institute for Liberal Values. So our theme on looking at Unveiled is really looking at the illiberal trends that Yasmine uncovers in her book. And we're going to break this up into three various sessions on various illiberal trends that we have found in the book. The first one we're looking at is totalitarian control and how that has affected Yasmine in her personal individual bodily autonomy. Before we get started, I want to introduce, there's going to be various people coming out for the various three sessions that we're having, but we've got myself, Jennifer Richmond, who is the co-founder of the Institute for Liberal Values. I'll let everyone kind of introduce themselves when they start talking, but we have Wingfield Twyman, who is an attorney and the co-author of our book, Letters in Black and White. We have Diana Blum, who is a parent activist and very how would you say in the anti-Semitism space mainly, but also in the education space. And some of the trends that we're going to be talking about with Unveiled are trends that you are seeing actually playing out in the education space. And so incredible input from you. And Mars, you and I are together in the Clarity Coalition, which is something that Yasmine actually founded based on some of the principles that she talks about in Unveiled, some of the liberal principles that her book sheds light on, and the need for us to have these liberal principles in order to thwart the illiberalism that we see in some of these fundamentalist totalitarian movements. And Mars, you also are quite the activist for liberalism and part of ILV as well. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. With that, I'll let you introduce yourselves a little bit. But my biggest question just to start with is, holy crap. This book was a game changer for me. I remember for me, I kept on asking my colleague, Brandy Shupatinsky, who will be part of this book club at one point, I just don't understand. I don't understand how we are allowing some of these illiberal principles that we see in Islam fundamentalism into America. How do we not know this? And she goes, just read Unveiled. And it was like a culture shock. It was a culture shock. And then to know, and we'll get more into like Western liberalism and how Western liberalism promotes some of these illiberal values that Yasmine had to face. But I didn't know what I didn't know. And so that's where I kind of came into it. And I'd love to hear just kind of first impressions before we get into totalitarian control and Yasmine's experience with her bodily autonomy. So jump in.
I had a
first impressions of the book.
Go ahead, Mars.
Go ahead, Diane.
I was just saying I had a roller coaster of emotions reading it, because I too am a immigrant and grew up in Western America, but came from a communist regime country, which is not as, there's a lot of overlap with, extreme Islamism. And so hearing kind of that next level of extremism from her life experience just put a lot of things in perspective, and also validated a lot of what, I kind of saw growing up in this, dual world of trying to be the good girl in a, Russian family, but trying to, assimilate into American culture. So it was, just a roller coaster of emotion, a lot of anger and some fear when she talked about her abuse. It was visceral. And then just the anger came from the Canadian, perspective of trying to be good at, make it normalizing basically what is child abuse. But we're okay with it because, it's their culture, and it's such a bigotry of, mindset that, yeah, that's where my anger came through. So first thoughts. Mars, sorry.
Okay, so this was a very, very emotional subject for me because it actually, okay, so a little bit about my background. I got involved in everything we're seeing right now in the woke and anti-woke spaces because of my interest in the intellectual arena. I actually entered this as an atheist, and my participation in a lot of philosophical and atheist movements. This is the subject that really, really introduced me to the idea that there was something very, very wrong in the progressive world when, like, you come in as an individual who really, really stands for ideas like gay rights. My best friend, my best friend from high school, is gay, and it came down to a decision as someone who was raised Lutheran, whether I wanted to walk away from that, or do I want to support my friend who lives what some would call an alternative lifestyle? And that decision was very, very easy to make. But in some of those spaces, some people I considered mentors, made it very, very clear to me that something was very, very wrong. There was a hypocrisy in how progressives would go ham on, say, far right Christianity, but they would give a pass to Islamic fundamentalists. And I didn't believe it at first, but it didn't take long to look into that work, to be familiar with what they were talking about. If you read Ayaan Hirsi Ali's stories, I've read all 3 of her books, and she had a harrowing story as someone who grew up in Somalia and went to Saudi Arabia, and then then had to escape a forced marriage, and has to have bodyguards on her 24/7 because of, do I really need to answer? Do I really need to point out what happened to Salman Rushdie? So somewhere along this line, I started following a lot of people in the ex-Muslim world, like Sarah Hyder, Mohammed Syed, who was just on another podcast I did, and Ali Rizvi, Armin Navabi, a whole bunch of people, and they really, really introduced me to the ideas, like, what was going on in the Islamic world, Islamic fundamentalist world, to be more precise. And I came across Yasmine's story, and now I met her at the premiere of the Islam and the Future of Tolerance movie several years ago. We got to talking on X, and I've done several podcasts with her, and we met her in the Clarity Coalition, and like reading her book, it was a very, very difficult read because I actually had to throw it down a few times because I was so disgusted with how a mother can treat her child in that kind of fashion, and the kind of excuses you would have to conjure up in your own mind to follow the dictates of your own religion to justify child abuse, to justify misogyny, and the whole host of other fundamentalist practices that go against anything we would consider progressivism and even liberalism. It just really, really drove home to me the idea that something hypocritical is going on in our dialogue, and we see this reflected in some way, shape, or form everywhere nowadays. She talks about in the book how she's forced to put on the hijab, niqab, the abaya, and the issues from that are really driven home when you take into account what's happening in Iran now. And 2 years ago, you had a young girl by the name of Mahsa Amini who was beaten to death because she was improperly wearing her hijab. And what do you see? Do you see progressives really speaking out against that? You don't. Like, they didn't speak up for Yasmine when she had an opportunity to get away from her family in Canada. So that was a real slap in the face for anyone who considers themselves progressive. You really have to look in yourself in the mirror and ask yourself, what exactly am I supporting? What exactly do I stand for? And do the people I'm around, are they really driving in the same direction I am? And for the most part, I had to say the answer was no.
The hard act to follow, as they say, cliche. When I read this book, I felt it was one of the most difficult books I had read. I ranked it up there with American Slavery as It Is by Theodore Well. in a book, My Little Life, I think, by an author, which talks about sexual abuse of little boys and depression associated with religion. And so, but unfortunately, we're living in the year today, 2016, and it's not the 1600s or 1700s when you had legalized slavery. And yet I kept feeling that there was a slavery of the spirit, a slavery of the mind that Yasmine was subjected to. And to me, that's one of the most horrible things imaginable, to feel that you cannot think your thoughts because of religious dictates, because of religious dogma. That's insufferable to me. And then also just the acts of abuse. I won't repeat them, but they were just unspeakable. And I mean, to the degree where, and you guys may agree or disagree, I wondered if the mother was actually in the realm of mental disorder or mental delusion, separate and apart from the religious dogmatic dictates of radical Islam. I don't know, but the actions that she took, to me, suggested a severe break with the traditional maternal forms of affection for children. But having said that, I really came at this from a very light Christian heritage. I inherited Christianity from my ancestors dating back to the 1800s. And Christianity, and how I thought of religion, it was never force plus compliance. It's never been very alien for me in my universe. So this was very eye-opening for me to peer into a family where religion was force plus compliance. I was particularly unsettled by the idea of segregation based on religion as a good. In the book Unveiled, Yasmine talks about her mother's edicts that she never be friends with non-believers, that the non-believers are destined for hell. And I thought to myself, hey, I'm kind of a nice guy. Am I destined for hell? I don't get this. But what really iced the cake for me, you guys, was this just barbaric, caveman, Stone Age, visceral hate for those who happen to be Jewish. That just does not sit well with me, and it never has, and it never will. And I kind of felt, my word, I live in a world where there are families that take this as an operating premise for life, and a world where there are people like Catherine Brodsky who suffer because of stereotypes and caricatures based upon Jewish identity. And that's, to me, very troubling and eye-opening, that I can live in a world where these two ways of being coexist. So that's all I can really say, because as I mentioned before, I came from a Christian heritage, and religion was never force plus compliance. So this was certainly an eye-opening read for me. Very troubling, very disturbing. But in the end, I think the book was a good constructive plus for the readers and for the world. That's,
you know, Wink, you mentioned something that I want to circle back to. So for our audience, before Wink and I started writing our book, Wink had me read the book Slavery as It Is, or
yes,
is it Slavery as It Was?
As it is.
As it is. And it was literally, I mean, I don't know how many pages, but 900 stories of just
1001 eyewitness accounts of American slavery.
Eyewitness accounts. And the one that I thought was the craziest was this one where literally a slave was being, his punishment, he was being chopped off from the foot all the way up, and his body parts while he was alive being thrown into the fire. And I know, Wink, you said I'm not going to go into some of the brutality, but I think it's important. I mean, you asked me to read this book because you wanted me to understand the true brutality. Right. So with regard to brutality that we saw in this book, the thing that really shocked me the most in her personal story was the story of where she was hung and whipped. And for our audience, hopefully you're reading along, but what I don't want to give away too much, but her mother thought that she was dead as a result of this whipping, this punishment. And her concern wasn't that for her daughter, and their daughter was dead. Her concern was they were going to get caught. And what were they going to do about that? And so, Wink, to your point on, hearing these stories of brutality, I think are so important for us to really understand what's going on. And that's not to say, that every Islamic family or Muslim family, this is a fundamentalist kind of ideology, but this is happening. And I don't think that Yasmine's story is necessarily unique.
It isn't. It definitely isn't unique. There's a podcast that we just did with Mohammed Syed from Ex-Muslims in North America. This actually happens more often than we think. A lot of the stuff happens to go under the radar. Yet you have these people sent back to fundamentalist Islamic countries to get married or have some kind of procedure. By procedure, I mean that's a euphemism for female genital mutilation, and they were able to stop several of them because because of the resources they have in that organization, along with the Freedom from Religion Foundation, to do what they can to prevent cases like this from occurring. I mean, Jennifer, you were on the other podcast I was doing with Raheel Raza, right? She mentioned that this. She corroborated with what Mohammed Syed said. Like, this actually is, for better or worse, commonplace. So Yasmine's story, it was absolutely flagrant, absolutely horrible, but it is also not unique. She also brought up in the book several other circumstances of other people who are under the thumb of fundamentalist Islam, who have to suffer this, and this is happening in modern day Western liberal democracy.
All under the guise of we have to be culturally sensitive, right? This whole bullshit, term of cultural relativism. The first time I ever came across that was in college in a cultural anthropology class. My background is I'm a neurologist, so science. And so then I'm sitting in this cultural anthropology class when they're discussing this term that to me was basically some kind of inversion of moral clarity. And that's what I'm kind of seeing in society is this postmodern, right, world that we're living in is basically post-truth, where what we always knew is what is moral clarity fundamentally, and I think this ties into why Jews are hated so much, is that we, if you go back and 10 Commandments and Moses, and that is the fundamental definition of where our moral clarity comes from, right? Thou shalt not kill, right? We are a life culture. We're not a death culture. And this is kind of flipping everything upside down. That's how why I'm, still struggling with when you hear about what's happening in Britain, right? And the grooming scandal and all of that for decades was allowed because we have to be culturally sensitive, right? It's like such a disconnect with what is right, and yet here we are. Sorry, I went off on a tangent, but that's the way I perceive all of this. How did we get here?
I don't think postmodernism is necessarily is precisely what goes on behind this. I think there's a lot of ignorance as to how exactly a modern liberal society works that put us in this position. And what do I mean by that? Well, okay, so criticizing another culture is considered to be racist, and why is that? Why is that so? Well, if you look back at, there's something being thrown around today about the idea of, like, quote unquote decolonization. That idea became very, very prominent at the turn of the 20th century. There were movements, there were peoples who were arguing that because of the crimes of colonialization, people had a right to be able to determine their own fates, determine their own destinies, like they do in Western democracies. But there's a huge disconnect between the execution and the actual practice. So, when you're talking about self-determinations for a people, what do you mean by people? Who speaks for a people? Who determines a group? Who speaks for the subgroups within that group? That only really happens in the aegis of a Western liberal democracy, because you have institutions, you have laws to protect rights down to the level of the individual. That's why you have a Bill of Rights. That's why you had such a conflict between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists during the founding of the United States, because they were concerned that they were forming too strong of a government, and they wanted to protect the rights of the individual down to the singular person. When you went around to the practice of decolonization, when you started giving cultures back their right to self-determine, what do you mean by self-determination? You're giving people back the idea to practice their own culture. But just because you're practicing a culture doesn't mean you're protecting the rights of the people in that group. You still have discrimination because of groups like women in a culture. Do they really want to be treated that way? I don't think so. What about the LGBTQ community in those cultures? Do they want to be treated like? Do they want to be discriminated against in that culture? No. And what about caste groups? So how are their rights? How is their autonomy protected in that culture? And when you're calling people out for being racist, for criticizing a culture, you're effectively trying to argue against bigotry. But when you're allowing bigotry to happen on that large of an aegis, and not willing to look at what's happening in that culture, you're really defending bigotry when you're calling someone something racist on that level. So when we're talking about we want to protect people's freedoms, we want to protect individual rights or whatnot, but the reality of it is you're looking at this from a Western standpoint. You can enjoy your individual freedoms because we have institutions that protect them, and you're so far removed from the time when we were living under similar conditions that you can look back on that, and you have no idea what you're looking back on and what you're forgetting from history. So when that racist accusation is actually very, very rich, because you're effectively by throwing it out so flagrantly, you're actually defending bigotry.
That makes sense to me.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense to me. I think this idea that culture equals race and race equals culture, I've written about that a few times. One of my ironies as I grow older is this movement of decolonization, as Mars references, because to me, in my experience, what has happened is, for example, authentic Black American history has been colonized by movements like Black Studies or liberated ethnic studies. And there's a total disconnect between how dogmatists and those who believe collectivism allow Black history to be presented. And it's not really true to how Black history was lived by those who were Black Americans. For example, one will search long and hard and long, to find any reference positive to Black churches and Black ethnic studies or liberated ethnic studies. You'll read about revolutionaries and Black Panther types and Nat Turner, but one won't read about organic Black American history as it was lived in, say, the 1950s or the 1970s, particularly in southern small towns. And so to me, that kind of goes to Mars' point quite well, is that when you define culture as race and race as culture, well, who gets to decide what the culture is that defines race? What goes into that? And how do you avoid the downside of colonizing authentic Black American history for whatever collectivist purposes you may have? So that's kind of my thought about that.
Well, so again, you mentioned a couple of words that I want to pick up on: collectivists. And so we're talking about something that is a totalitarian ideology. And I really want to touch on, and then you also mentioned like liberated ethnic studies. And we've had this, all of us in separate forums and also even together have had this conversation, but like kind of the origin of liberated ethnic studies is this Marxist ideology. And this Marxist ideology, even though Marxism and Islam are not the same, we've seen this kind of red-green alliance, if you will. And a lot of it is around this fundamentalist totalitarian view, even if what they're fighting for, or what they want, their ultimate goals are completely different. That alliance has been formed as a result of those ideologies, those totalitarian ideologies. So I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that, and it's those ties to kind of Marxist ideology and totalitarian ideology, and how we've seen that play out in other ways outside of Islam, and whether or not we've ever seen anything good come out of that.
Well, it's interesting. I think that if you want to peer like a microscope into the cultural milieu and the ideological waves of the day, look at the words people use. Look at the words people say. Look at the words people manipulate. So, for example, one of my great heroes was the former president of Howard University, historically Black University, Washington, D.C., Mordecai Johnson. And if you read his addresses to Black congregations and to Howard University in the 1920s, you see an emphasis on humanity, humankind. The idea that the goal is to have all of God's children, whatever color, be on the same level, the same plane of humanity. But nowadays, one peers into the linguistic haze, and one sees increasing use of the word allyship. Well, you have allies when you're at war. You have allies in times of military conflict. And so to me, that increasing use of the word ally explains the convergence of fundamentalism, religious-wise, and neo-Marxism, because they're using these words ally and allyship, which almost replicates World War II or World War I. But in this case, the war is a spiritual war between collectivism and individualism. And those who are aimed against the individual naturally see themselves as allies in a common cause. Ergo, the increasing use of the word ally and allyship in some spaces. That's kind of my thought, Jennifer.
Yeah, it's the erasure of individual human dignity. It's almost the opposite of the last book club that we did on, empowered humanity theory.
Yes, that's right.
Right?
Thank you, Diana.
Exactly. And it's almost like cultural autonomy versus human autonomy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the collective is always, there's some greater good out there, but it's always at the expense of individual human dignity. And that's
Right.
why it doesn't lead to good things down the road, because when
It's an
you
inversion, to use your
sacrifice,
term.
exactly.
It's an upside down world leading to a bad outcome. And sadly, we don't learn from history, right? I think if you look at the history of humankind, I think we're always on the ascent when we cherish human dignity, creative expression, and the individual. I think we're always in the decline when we force people to suppress their creative expression, when we force people to suppress their individual sense of self as a human, when we force people to suppress the individual aspects of their personality. I mean, so it's almost like dark shadows. We're leaving the light of the founding fathers, and we're in the dark shadows of a new age. But I want to be optimistic, ladies and gentlemen, and I've written about this. I do think this is generational, and ultimately, there will come a point, I think, when the young kids yet to be born will grow up and they will rebel against the dark shadows of their grandparents and parents, because they will want to live in freedom and not in darkness. That's
Do you
my
think
thought.
that's the case, though, Link? Because what you just described is indicative of some of the more totalitarian regimes you see in the 20th century, like in China with with what happened to Mao Zedong. I mean, he turned. There were student revolutions that are not. I don't want to say they're on the scale of what happened in China, but they're similar to what's happening now. When people were forced to stand up and say things that they didn't even mean in order to follow along with the stuff that Mao Zedong was putting out there, and there was definitely a lot of wordplay in place to really filter people's chains of thought. One obvious example I'll throw out there is the title of China's of the country of China, the People's Republic of China. And no sane person who knows what is familiar with the ideas behind a republic would ever call China a republic or a democracy in any way, shape, or form. But it's a hoodwinking of terms that you see very, very common in woke ideology, whether it comes from the left or the right. And what ultimately, quote unquote, overthrew Mao Zedong wasn't something that overthrew Mao Zedong. He just died, and the systems in place were so horrific that it took a generation to come back afterwards to rebuild it. So we don't learn from history, and I wonder if it's really going to take a generation of witnessing mistakes and failures in a Western democracy for us to really, really come back from this. There was a really interesting dialogue that happened between Ayaan Hirsi Ali and Sarah Hyder several years ago when they were talking about how to push back against this ideology. And like Ayaan was arguing that it was at the gates. Sarah Hyder had a completely different idea. She said that the barbarians are already within our gates. There is no pushing it back. There's only waiting until until a generation passes before it can rise up again to restore it. Now, I don't want to speak for Sarah. She's one of my favorite intellectuals. Very, very well spoken. Very well.
Oh, I love Sarah.
But that's the idea that's what she came up to me as saying. So I'm not as optimistic.
Oh, interesting. I think I am one, just because I'm genetically a positive person. So I think I live in positivity. But number two, I think it's because as well, you're beginning to see the cracks already, are you not? I'm sure everyone is aware of the recent viral article called The Lost Generation by a writer named Savage. And in The Lost Generation, this guy, he's a white guy in the creative arts in Southern California. He writes about how an entire generation, I think it's the millennials and those younger, have basically been shut out of jobs in corporate America, in the creative side, Hollywood, because of their race and gender. It's basically no white males need apply. And if you look at the stats, you can see that plays out that way. To me, when you begin to see dissident articles like that go viral, they're not suppressed, they're not hidden, they're not like kept in a brown paper bag at night, but they go viral. To me, that might suggest more maybe a cracking in the cement of woke doctrine, but it's just a crack. It's not the generational turn, but it's there for Generation Alpha to read and take in, because if you're born in the year 2030 or the year 2031 and you come of age in the 2030s and the 2040s, you don't want your future to be the lost generation by Mr. Savage. You want a different future, right? You want a more free future. That's my thing.
Yeah, but I wonder though, like going back to Yasmine's story, I mean, she literally, how they manipulated her body from wearing to what she wore to how she was punished. I mean, she did not even know. Obviously, it's the story of her, like, her journey where she did realize. But to Mars's point, during the Cultural Revolution and where they block out media and everything, like you've got Yasmine's mother, who everything is haram, it's bad, it's evil, and you're like scared. This is what you learn from since you're a child, and you're like scared of the outside world, and it kind of it's meant to do that. It's meant to isolate you, if you will. And so while I think that those stories matter, are those stories getting to the people who it's getting to us? That's great. And I guess like knowing that there are instances of what Yasmine went through still happening, even in places like the United States and America, I guess that gives us that insight to make the change. But I worry about people who don't even know what they don't know. I heard this like as an example. Someone was talking about this town in Texas that now they're trying to go after. It's called Epic City, and one of the things is everything in this city. It's all the houses are for Muslims. All the I was going to say synagogues. All the they're all mosques. All the businesses are owned by Muslims. And so even though they are living in America, this one little community lives by Sharia law. And so if you are a woman living in this community by Sharia law and you are not allowed to go out, because by Sharia law, you're not allowed to go out on your own. And if you do go out on your own, you're fully covered. You don't, this kind of abuse is happening in places like Houston, Texas, because of this isolation, through punishment, through, all these scare tactics. So that's what worries me, is the people that need to know this aren't going to know this, unless we kind of break this habit open in the United States and in other Western liberal democracies.
But how do we do that as a free society?
Well, it's interesting to see how that happens here in the United States, because if we're talking about the lost generation, and we're talking about preserving liberal norms that prevent the circumstances that Yasmine had to deal with, you have to have a people who are actually intellectually curious as to the ideas behind liberalism and why is that's such a value. Again, we're so far removed from the time that liberalism doesn't exist, that you have the luxury of criticizing the freedoms that you have today. The irony is you're seeing this happen in the United States, but have you ever heard of a Faisal Saeed al-Mutar? Do you know who he is?
No.
He runs an organization called, he used to run it with Melissa Chin called, I forgot what it is. It's an organization that's supported by Steven Pinker, in which they take books like Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now, The Better Angels of Our Nature, works by John Locke, by Montesquieu, the Enlightenment philosophers, etc. Taking everything that teaches about secularism, liberalism, free speech, etc., knowledge bombing areas of the Middle East, teaching about liberalism, teaching about evolution, throwing in Richard Dawkins' books, everything out there to challenge the fundamentalism in those cultures and trying to affect a shift, a change in ideas. And people are eating them up. They get downloads all the time to challenge the orthodoxy there is over there. But that same kind of intellectual curiosity, I hate to say it, but I think it's lacking in the United States because of selective ignorance. Go back to the idea of free speech, for example. This is a topic that's just infuriated me as of late, because I used to be against the woke on this, but I am also now very, very virulent against the anti-woke, because you start seeing people speaking about the principle and against it. But the words they're using, the phrases they're bringing, the cases they're bringing up, make it clear that they either never cared about it in the first place, or they're completely ignorant about it. Like, for instance, when I hear someone say, "You can't shout fire in a crowded theater," that's a dead giveaway. They've never studied a single case beyond 1919, beyond the First Amendment. It's like citing medical advice from the 1919. It's outdated, and you don't know what you're talking about. And do you care to learn? If the answer is no, if you're not willing to look and explore the roots of whatever if you're not willing to explore the roots, and by extension the value of what it is we have today and why the laws work the way they do, then in my opinion we will see many more cases of the allowance of this kind of religious fundamentalism, and we'll see these crimes happen to other people, like what happened to Yasmine. Are people really, really interested in learning about the laws that give us this free society we live in? And are they willing to preserve them on principle, not by narrative? And sadly, in my experience, the answer is no.
Yeah, when I think of, I always think my emphasis goes to what's happening in our own Jewish community. And just like Yasmine is kind of fighting an uphill battle, as an ex-Muslim speaking up against extremist Islamists, we're having our own debates within our own Jewish community on what is driving, anti-Semitism. And the big hot topic right now is Israel committing genocide, right? And when I look at the how it's so easy to submit to ideology, even at the expense of your own peoplehood, I tend to be pessimistic. So the big thing happening, here in California is the recent Scott Wiener, who's, I don't know if you guys are following this story, but it has been an explosion of he coming out. He's running for Nancy Pelosi's seat under pressure to call Israel committing genocide, and so this was like a breaking point for a lot of the Jewish legacy orgs to finally say, whoa, wait a second, like you're literally throwing us under the bus, right? And yet they're not taking it to that next level of actually holding him accountable for those words. And so if we can't within our own community find the moral courage to hold someone accountable for that, just like I don't know, I get very pessimistic myself. And here's where my optimism comes from, and it has to do with actually the gender stuff that's happening right now, with the whole trans and what's happening in the Supreme Court. And we are trying to redefine what biological truth is. And I think we're actually making progress there. Like I personally think, 10 years from now, gender affirming care in children is going to go down as, the biggest crimes against humanity in medicine. So seeing where there is some hope is what fuels my bucket to keep doing this and fighting the good fight. And I pray that, if we can establish some truth here, and I think gender is going to be, because at the end of the day, gender is 50-50, right? Whereas cultural, there's so many different cultures out there, and you can play devil's advocate and peg groups against each other. Whereas I think it's a little bit easier to define truth when it comes to gender. But no, overall, I tend to sway with Mars a little, where it's it's hard when you see and you see what's happening in Iran, right? Like, how is it that these people are not standing up, the same people that claim to be for human rights, and here you have a country of humans rising against an oppressive regime, and we are not doing a whole lot about it. So yeah, sorry.
I mean, that brings me to this idea, though, of multiculturalism, right? And so, and American values. I mean, is there such a thing as American values? I'm actually, where I'm starting to wonder is if that idea of universal values is dead. I mean, I know that when we start to talk about multiculturalism, I mean, is there universal values? This goes to our conversation also on cultural relativism. So where do we draw the line on what it means to be American, regardless of your culture, your background, your ethnicity, your color? Is it possible for us to come together under these universal human rights, universal values? And I don't know that it is. That's where I'm pessimistic.
But isn't the universal American value, when all is said and done, the U.S. Constitution? Because that kind of cements us in terms of what our unifying principles are. So if you're anti-U.S. Constitution, then you don't hold American values. Do you think that's a fair argument?
I do, but so I think that so many, just going back to the example I gave of Epic City, and I mean, they are not following the American Constitution, and so I would say, I would argue, at least in this case, and probably in other similar fundamentalist case, is not only just with Islam, but with other kind of extreme ideologies. No, they don't believe in the Constitution. So what's the solution?
Lawsuits, litigation. You should have some nonprofit organization go, I mean, that's just me as an attorney thinking that if you're violating the U.S. Constitution, that's our fundamental law as a country doctrine, then you need to be held accountable for that.
Sorry for interrupting earlier.
No, go right ahead, Mars.
Here's the thing. This is an interesting viewpoint that was raised to me several years ago in some discussions I was involved in this topic. Someone said something that I thought was pretty profound. I don't want a multicultural society. I want a multi-ethnic one. Cultural values aren't always compatible. Like, am I going to get along with someone who thinks it's okay to beat a woman because she doesn't want to have sex with you? You and I are not going to get along. Are you going to kill someone because they're gay? You and I are not going to get along. Are you going to criticize? Are you going to criticize or demean someone because they're black, brown, Asian, whatever? You and I are not going to get along. When people are talking about a multicultural society, what I think they usually mean is like you want the best of the society. You want to bring in work ethics. You want to bring in things like art, music, things that fall under the aegis of culture. But when you start blending together like moral values that are not compatible, you cannot bring those into play. And like, when it comes down to American values, you're inevitably diving down to the idea of liberal values. And I'll put it the way I think John Locke would put it, the proto-liberal. He was an enlightenment philosopher who came up during the times post the 30 Years' War, in which there were religious wars in Europe that demanded that you follow this particular version of Christianity. You follow it or you die. And that even post John Locke's, I think post John Locke's time, when it came here to the United States, you had you had groups that would criticize as you would characterize as Christian fundamentalism, establishing religious laws in colonies. Virginia was an Anglican colony. They kept out Jews for 2 generations, and they instituted a religious test you had to take in order if you want to take a place in the government. Puritans set up governments in Massachusetts, and you couldn't participate in that government. And God help you if you were a Quaker in that township.
Mars, if I can interject just a moment.
If I could continue.
Go ahead.
First, okay.
Sure, go right ahead.
When it came down to it, John Locke realized that you have to let people believe as they believe. You have to allow people to pursue whatever it is, pursue their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That is an American value. But eventually, we diverge from that. You're free to do whatever you want as long as you hew to core principles, like cognitive freedom. You give your right to adjudicate third-party disputes, especially when it comes to violence to a third party. That government is there to protect your rights. Those are the core values that you adhere to in a Western liberal democracy. Everything else branches off from there. But if you don't adhere to those core values, then I don't think you should be a part of our society. I really don't. And you can be multi-ethnic and you can incorporate aspects of culture, but unless you hew to these core values, then well, long story short, multiculturalism without that core aspect cannot exist. Like you want a multi-ethnic society based on core concepts, principles, and values. If you don't, then you cannot have a multicultural society unless it's based on that background and without those limitations.
I am so eager to jump in. First, I want to thank Mars for bringing attention to the multi-ethnic versus multicultural distinction. I think that's on point. I think that's insightful, and it resonates with me. I recently wrote an essay. I called it The Future Face of America, because I think, as you suggest, Mars, America really is indivisibly a multi-ethnic country. America, for example, is about 13.7% Black. And so in my essay, I suggested that the future face of America would look like that. It would look like Carly Simon, who's 10% Black. It would look like Danielle Romero, who Jen and I know, who's probably 10% Black. It would look like my cousin Jamie Smith, who's probably 15 to 20% Black. And I thought that was a great thing, a great future to envision, a multi-ethnic future, the future face of America. Well, come to find out, I think a day or two later, I shared with Jen, a bunch of bullies had so bullied Danielle Romero, someone Jen and I know, that she basically closed down her YouTube channel because I guess these bullies didn't like the idea so much of a white American just openly embracing the fact that she had Black ancestors. It was nonchalant to her. She was expanding knowledge, but there was such animosity against that some bullies successfully pushed her off of YouTube. To me, that's very disappointing because I think when you look upon Danielle's face, you are indeed looking at the future face of America, of a multi-ethnic America. So having said that, turning to your point about Virginia, I was born and raised in Virginia, as you probably know, and I just wanted to take an opportunity to defend Virginia a little bit when it comes to religious tolerance. As you know for sure, Thomas Jefferson took the lead in terms of religious tolerance for Virginia, both as governor of Virginia and probably before that as well. Moreover, George Washington, one of my favorite founding fathers, was very much at the lead of embracing Jewish Americans during this time period. Sure. His doctor, for example, who took care of his stepdaughter Patsy, was Jewish. He used to have dinners with Mordecai, I forget the guy's last name, but he was a Jewish merchant in Virginia. In Rhode Island, Newport, Rhode Island, he was beseeched by a group of Jewish merchants for assurance that they were indeed part of the American body politic and would not be persecuted based upon their religious identity. And he wrote a very famous letter, George Washington, making it clear that America from the start does not recognize distinctions of religion. It doesn't matter if you're Jewish, Protestant, Muslim, whatever, we're all Americans. And I thought that was very good because our founding father of fathers, George Washington, did not recognize or accept anti-Semitism as part of our founding spirit. And then final point, Mars, it just so happens in discovering my genealogy, my personal genealogy, that my ancestors knew the very religious persecution you're talking about. There was a group called the French Huguenots, and they lived in Catholic France, and they were just decimated. I think it was the Saint Bartholomew's massacre. There was a great massacre in France, and basically tens of thousands of French Protestants were murdered just because of their religion. And eventually, you know the story maybe, they fled to England. And in England, people refer to them as refugees. So the original refugees in world history were French Huguenots escaping religious persecution in France. And then the French Huguenots moved across the ocean to Virginia, to Chesterfield County, where I grew up, and many of them are in my family tree. So they indeed saw America as the land of religious opportunity. And when I was growing up, the Huguenots were just part of the backdrop. There was a Huguenot Turnpike, a Huguenot High School, Huguenot Park, Huguenot School. We were so removed from the religious wars in Europe in the 1300s that we didn't see a distinction between ourselves and French Huguenots who were part of our past in our counties. I guess my point is that, yes, there is resistance to a multi-ethnic American future, but I do think the face of America will be multi-ethnic. And I do think that Virginia was probably a little bit more welcoming of religious dissidents than you might have suggested. That's all.
There's very little to disagree there, Wink, and I certainly didn't mean to impute the individuals that you brought up, but I would argue though that it did not start out that way. It probably got there later on, but there was this discrimination for several generations, and yes, religious tolerance was something that gradually came upon the United States. I think that before the Revolutionary War, they were gathering delegates together to discuss what they were going to do about the coming war with England. But in that initial meeting, it was in danger of never getting off the ground because they were all at each other's throats because they didn't recognize each other's beliefs, their religions, whatever. Sam Adams had to stand up and ask someone who was, I think, from a completely different religious denomination from him, ask him to lead the prayers and say, you start this meeting with a prayer. I'm not a bigot. Your version of Christianity, present as you please, in order to get that kicked off. So, yes, I definitely see your point.
Oh, that was all. That was all. Had to defend the Virginia honor.
Of course. Yeah.
I guess I have a question about how you guys define what American it for me. Being American or American values is the ability to you be you, I be me. But the line is when you being you, now you're forcing me to me be you. So when schools have this new goal of everyone has to belong, but it's their definition of belonging, right? And so me being me, I no longer belong. And that's where I think my concern is that we are erasing what American values is in the next generations through our schools. I you know I see this as where the fight needs to happen. We need to change what is actually being taught, because, as you know, I mentioned at our last when we did our last book club, is our brain gets wired, right? The next generation, the developing brain, with what we practice, and if we're constantly practicing this othering, we are straying away from fundamentally what American values are.
Are we adopting, Diana, an American Soviet mentality? What do you think?
We're definitely, I mean, I think that is what this cultural Marxism that is now becoming, hardwired into the next generation, they're uplifting this dogma. And I don't think they think there's anything wrong with it. I mean, communism isn't taught as a negative. It's all wonderful kumbaya collectivism,
Mr.
which is
M.
this, which is the same thing that basically has condoned the abuse that Yasmine experienced. I mean, it's one naturally leads to the next.
So Diana, I'm sorry, go ahead, Mars.
Go ahead, please. I talk too much.
Well,
no.
Yeah, there's no talking too much. So I was actually going to take us to kind of like a final thought. So jump in.
No, please go ahead. I'll go after you.
Well, I would love to know, for all of you, Diana, you mentioned education and how the solution needs to come through education. I would love to hear from you on what that looks like. I know, we've all four of us have worked together in the education space. We've seen, Wink mentioned before, liberated ethnic studies, which is, basically cultural Marxism. We see the cultural Marxism kind of bleeding into more than just ethnic studies, into writing and English and even math. My goodness, how can you do this to math? But what is it that would turn the tide? Is it, just sticking to the basics? Is it, what is it that we're missing, Diana, that you think that would address both this cultural Marxism, but the fundamentalism and the totalitarian that we also are seeing in fundamentalist Islam?
I think getting back to education, period. Like, what are basic education, literacy, basic math skills? I mean, we are straying away from what empowers a human, which is knowledge, to political activism. I mean, what we see in our schools, and this is now not just in ethnic studies, it's in every classroom, it's in math, it's in science, it's the replacement of fundamental truths and basic knowledge and skills that actually build critical thinking to, this is how you need to think. So it's not how to think, it's not how to engage the brain and formulate ideas, and that requires a fundamental basic, foundation in how to read, how to write, all. We're getting away from that into this, everything is through this power lens. Everything is through this oppressor oppress, which naturally forces the othering, which is where we are, so, and, I think this is largely based on the agenda that the teachers unions have created. I mean, until we actually talk about the root causes, which I believe it's the, you know, it's a political agenda that's in our schools. So until we address that, we're going to continue spiral down this, ideological path.
Mm-hmm.
So just getting back to basic education, it sounds so simple, and yet that's not happening. Look at our outcomes. I mean, our kids can't read and write. So of course, when you have an undereducated population, that's much easier to brainwash with,
Agenda. It's dog. Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I'll go ahead and throw in my own 2 cents here. I'll send you the link to this podcast that we did as soon as it comes out. But several years ago, you had a really, really hard time broaching the concept of fundamentalist Islam in liberal circles. If you watch that old Bill Maher episode with Sam Harris and Ben Affleck,
which was talked about in this book, so we'll get to that. Bring it up now. Yes, that's going to be a constant.
I'll leave it for another time. But anyone who's interested can go onto the YouTube and see that self-righteous, excuse my French, that self-righteous moronic rant by Ben Affleck about how it's quote unquote gross and racist.
Mm-hmm.
I have to stop there, otherwise I'll start using language that's well above PG-13.
Stay self-regulated.
Yeah, I'll try. But back then it was so hard to broach the subject. But thankfully when we spoke to Mohammed, if I remember correctly, the needle has actually moved. A lot of people who are really liberal, or who are the proper term is truly liberal, or who are on the left, are more open to discussing Islam, the problems within Islam now, than previously. But the idea of returning to education as a prophylactic, I don't think that's enough. You're talking about the idea of teaching people how to think, and you're talking about the idea of teaching critical thinking. But let me ask you all a question: what does critical thinking mean? I'll give you my definition. Critical thinking is a blend of two modes of thought: rationalism and empiricism. Rationalism is being able to gather a bunch of circumstances and direct them towards a conclusion that you think is where all these reasons end up falling together. But if you just use rationalism, you're not much more than a conspiracy theorist. In order for your thoughts to take coherence, in order for it to be true, you have to narrow down the assumptions you make from point to point that go to that conclusion. How do you do that? You need additional reasoning, and you have to tie it to the actual reality by anchoring it to the real world through evidence-based thought. That's the modernist theory. Pre-modern thought began from presupposition. You assume something is true, and you build and you derive from that assumed truth. But if that assumed truth is not true, everything under it falls to pieces. And postmodernism just believes that everything is power-based. There is an objective reality, but it's always obscure, always whatever. Again, that's not anchored to reality. So how do you deal with this? You do need to teach basics. You do need to teach education. But if you want to teach people how to think, I would argue that you should start teaching ideas that came from Greek philosophy, like like questioning, questioning your assumptions, tying it to evidence. And whatnot, because that's inevitably all you can do to counter ideology. Ideology takes ideas that come in. And if you believe so wholeheartedly in one thing, like fundamentalist Islam, Marxism, whatsoever, if something deviates from that ideology, you have to mangle, shred, or dismiss evidence as it comes through that lens. So you teach this methodology of critical thinking, of rationalism and empiricism to drive yourself towards a home point. That's how you counter it. That's how you counter ideology. When we had to deal with gender ideologists, when we had to deal with fundamentalist Islam, you don't counter it by putting religion or some other kind of ideology in its place. You see Colin Wright go out there and speak the truth, tell you about like the gametes in each organism. When Yasmine speaks about fundamentalist Islam, you compare what occurs in fundamentalist Islam with the rights and quality of life that gays, homosexuals, and men are allowed to join in a Western liberal democracy. How do you counter ideological dogma? You teach critical thinking, but in order to do that, you have to teach what critical thinking is. and is
If I
not.
can just interject, it's based on scientific method principles, right? You have a hypothesis and then you have to challenge. You either prove the null hypothesis, right? You either prove or disprove. And exactly what you said with evidence. But it's based on scientific method principles. And that's the issue, is that that is under attack right now. It's actual, like, the way we prove truth isn't really being utilized. And I do think, like, all the discoveries, all the amazing things that we have are based on scientific method principles. And that's part of what we need to get back to. Sorry to interrupt, but
That's pretty much all I had to comment on that particular point.
But Mars, a quick question. Suppose someone says logic is white supremacy. Logic is racist. I refuse to accept that as a way to be in the world. What's your response to that? Maybe that's his response.
You're not a critical thinker.
I think that was his response.
Are you a victim? If logic is white supremacy, why should I listen to you? Just simply because you think, oh, poor me, I you need to listen to me because of my emotional exhortations. You see this narrative. A lot of what happens today is, I was talking about fundamentalist Islam earlier. Like a lot of fundamentalist Muslims claim victimhood because of Western Western imperialism past. In the reality, every single culture in the world has practiced it. There was an interview that happened several years ago between Annie Zonneveld, who runs Muslims for Progressive Values. I have some issues with the way she does things, but like I'll tolerate it for now. She was on an interview with Ilhan Omar. No one knew who she was. Everyone was paying attention to Ilhan Omar and what she had to say. Annie Zonneveld brought her the idea that, hey, could you please speak out more against female genital mutilation that happens in certain Muslim cultures? And Ilhan Omar just went, you know what? As a Muslim in the United States, it's so tiring to talk about that topic over and over again, which is, I thought, was the most ridiculous, self-righteous comment. One of the worst I've heard online. Someone but an extension to that, someone I know had the gall. She's a Muslim girl. Wonderful, no, just a presupposing, wonderful person generally. She wears a dress that has her cleavage all the way down to here, and sometimes wears a skirt above her knees. How would you get treated like that in a fundamentalist Muslim society? And she says, she had the gall to say, "This is what it's like to be a Muslim in the United States." Are you kidding? In Yasmine's book, in Egypt, you're wearing the full abaya. I think there's a statistic out there saying 99% of women there have been grabbed or somewhat sexually abused in some way. So when someone comes up to you and says, logic is white supremacy, etc., I would argue actually you're being a racist. You're saying that I need to. You're defending your views, which is ultimately a cover for misogyny and another form of bigotry, under emotional manipulation. And when it all comes down to it, you're trying to use logic to some extent to convince me otherwise. You're being a hypocrite here. And ultimately, what you're ultimately defending is not the desire to be treated as an equal individual. You're acting as a shield for bigotry. Why would I listen to you?
Well said.
It's a good response.
Yeah, well said. A shield for bigotry.
That should be the caption, the takeaway.
I mean, but I'm thinking about that though, Mars, too. And I mean, because we see that all the time. And this is why we see the cultural relativism, is that people are afraid that they are going to be called racist, bigot, whatever. And in truth, not discussing it is its own form of soft bigotry, and assuming that we don't have the logic or the ability to kind of parse through these, complex thoughts is in and of itself challenging.
Think about think about this. It's another form of the soft bigotry of low expectations. Another book I recommend everyone read from Unveiled is there's a book based on the movie Islam and the Future of Tolerance. It's a conversation between Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz. Majid he defends liberal values in that book by saying those people who did that to Yasmine, people who I'm going to spoil a part of the book here. In I forgot when it was, when she was, I think, in 7th grade, a teacher of hers, I think his name is Mr. Fabro, who noticed that she was coming in, she was depressed, bruised, whatever, and he reported what was happening in her Child Protective Services. The court, eventually the time came where the court had to make a decision to take her away from her abusive family and put her somewhere safe. But they said, no, cultures had their own ways of protecting children. Are you kidding? She was betrayed at that point. She felt betrayed at that point in her story, because what she was effectively being told was that these values are for people of certain ethnicities, but not for me. And Majid makes the point in Islam, the Future of Tolerance, by saying that these cultures are just going to be as they are. You're effectively saying that they are incapable of living up to a higher standard. That's another form of the bigotry of low expectations. You're pretty much confining them to saying these people are barbaric or whatever, incapable of living up to this case. You know, by speaking to moderate and progressive Muslims, that is not true. So ultimately what you're doing is just acting as a shield for bigotry. And when you allow people to take a victimhood stance saying you can't criticize my culture because it's bigoted, while you allow them to practice misogyny, homophobia, which are also forms of bigotry, I might add, it's a shield for it. That's all it boils down to. We're living in a multipolar, multicultural world today. Moral relativism is a very, very dangerous thing, because cultures are going to come smashing together because of the technology we have, how close we are in contact with each other. And when it inevitably turns into a clash of values, are you going to participate in a culture that embraces religious pluralism, that embraces the rights of women, of people who love differently than you do? Are you gonna embrace that? Are you gonna go back to the dark ages that are pre-enlightenment, in which you were relying on religious fundamentalism and pre-modern thought, which doesn't get anyone anywhere? Something to think about.
Absolutely. And something else to think about for our conversation next week. We'll continue on this theme when we're talking about freedom of consciousness. And I think that that's really important too, because that is a liberal value. And how have these totalitarian and fundamentalist regimes, controlled not just the way we dress or our physical bodies, but also how we think. So with that, thank you. Join us again next week. And remember, March 2nd, we will have a live stream with Yasmine Mohammed on IOV's social pages.